What's up, peaches? Welcome back to my channel. Today we are going to listen to Baby It's Cold Outside Chapter 4 Part 2. In case you have not been following, I am going to pop all of these into a Baby It's Cold Outside playlist so that it's for your convenience. You can listen to them. What's been going on in the story so far is that we are seeing that Daniel has this timeline that he's got for himself, and Maggie being in his home is interfering with that. And we are also seeing them both start to fall in love with each other. So if you'd like to check this out, it's available currently on Wattpad, and the link will be in the description. So let's get into it. Chapter 4 Part 2. Every year he allowed himself one day, only that one day, to grieve for a life gone so horribly wrong, for everything that was stolen from him, on the day that it was all taken, which also happened to be his birthday. That day was all the time he allowed himself before he picked up the pieces of himself and rebuilt his life again, until that same day the following year. He'd been in this cycle for so long he couldn't remember any other way. In fact, this year would be its 10th anniversary, Daniel realized, sitting for a moment thinking about his life. As he thought back, he identified that before Maggie came into his life, for a long time all he'd known was pain and isolation. His world had been grey, white and black, like an old movie, but she had brought colour, sensation, feeling back into his world. He felt as if he'd been seeing everything, including himself, for the very first time, and now he had to want her to leave. Daniel curled his knees to his body in anger, gripped his head with frustrated hands, and ate in the stony silence for a long time. Maggie woke up from a long, delicious dream, stretching languidly with a smile. She had dreamt of her host, or more particularly, the person she wanted her host to be. In her dream, Daniel told her that he thought she was beautiful, and that he had felt something between them from the moment he lay eyes on her. Dream Daniel began climbing on the bed as he told her how he felt about her, and promised not to hurt her, as she had been hurt in the past. It was at that point that his mouth and hands descended on her, Maggie recalled, and sighed dreamily as a faint blush rose to heat her cheeks. But unfortunately for her, dreams seldom came to life, and Dream Daniel was very different from the real one. He had smiled and talked of and shown her love and held her tight, talking about forever as he made a second attempt to prove his feelings for her. Her smile and blush slowly receded as she began to remember the real Daniel, who scowled and seemed angry, isolated and distrusting all the time. There were times that his actions belied his words, though, like when he held her and when he gazed into her eyes with that wounded look that seemed to beg her to hold him and make the painful shadows go away. Maggie sighed sadly. She wanted Daniel more and more as she spent time with him, enjoying his company, loving his intelligence and that unconscious sexiness he carried about him like an unseen cloak, but he was pushing her away. There was a strange boundary between them, something that Maggie couldn't seem to get around. She had seen that look in his eyes more than once, as if he were battling with himself over something. She wanted that something to be her. She wanted him to want her, and to want to kiss her, and do the things Dream Daniel had been eager to do with her and to her. That invisible wall Maggie had been trying to get around was part of the reason she was so desperate to get back on her feet. She had a very distinct feeling that whatever lay behind the hidden wooden door in the hallway had something to do with Daniel's barrier to her. She had no idea of the truth, but after recalling the tour of his house, she mused that perhaps she was taking things too personally. Maybe Daniel didn't just have a problem with her. Maybe he had a problem with everyone. Maggie expelled a quick breath. She was suddenly very eager to get to the bottom of the mystery. She felt compelled to save Daniel, as he had saved her, but even she had to admit that this was not the only reason she wanted to get to the bottom of everything. She may be having feelings for Daniel. Okay, that was definitely a lie. She definitely had some feelings for Daniel. But if it were to go anywhere once she left, and she knew that at some point she would have to leave, then she had best solve this thing soon. After supper, she mused in the darkness as her stomach let out an angry growl. Maggie grabbed her chair and wheeled herself out of the room, careful not to injure her foot further, because she figured she'd had enough action for at least one day. The lounge was bathed in a soft golden glow, and she heard the fire crackle happily as she came to the end of the passageway. The delicious smell of spiced meat lingered in the air as she stopped short and studied Daniel, who at this point more resembled a perfect honey-haired thinking David statue than a gorgeous troubled man. He was in a black jeans and a deep grey sweater, seeming to almost blend into the dark couch behind him. She would have missed him sitting there if it hadn't been for his head resting on his pale hands, which were balanced on the armrest as he stared into the fireplace. There was such a sad, hopeless look on his face that Maggie's breath caught in her throat. A physical ache took hold in her body to take him into her arms and soothe him as he had her earlier that day. She looked closer, trying to guess the reason for his upset, hoping that his demeanor would give her some clues. He was slumped slightly, but his back was ramrod stiff. At this she smiled, just like her Daniel to be proud and arrogant, even when he was at his weakest. She supposed that this was where most of his irritation came from, the need to seem tough and unbreakable. Hang on a second, Maggie thought with a frown. When did he become her Daniel? She might like him, but that didn't mean. Her stomach chose that moment to let out a very loud, unladylike roar. Daniel's eyebrows flew up as he turned his attention to her. "Oh, you're up," he remarked and stood, then moved towards her. "Yeah," she mumbled, hanging her head in shame as her cheeks burned. She mumbled the word food as her stomach growled a warning again. It seemed it had a mind of its own right at this moment. Daniel seemed pleasantly calm and didn't even call her out on her embarrassing situation. All he did was guide her to the seat before the fireplace, elevate her foot and lift the steaks off the fire. They were deliciously foreign-smelling T-bone steaks, Maggie realized with appreciation. "I hope you don't mind, but I made Moroccan spice T-bone steaks with roasted vegetables and Israeli couscous," he said, as he placed the fare onto plates in what Maggie could only describe as in an artful manner. Maggie let out a pleased sigh. "If I may be honest, I've never eaten at least half of the things on that plate, but it smells divine and I really don't mind the taste adventure." Daniel looked up, away from his task and into her eyes. Maggie cocked her head to the side and gave his shadowed face a small smile. His only response was to give an almost inaudible sigh and return back to preparing the meal. Daniel found it difficult to try keeping her at a distance when he liked everything about her. Maggie's smile faltered and she felt tears sting her eyes, which she hastily blinked away. It seemed that Daniel's chosen mood today was somber. It hurt her to acknowledge that what had happened between them today had not changed Daniel's attitudes toward her. That wasn't entirely true, she thought sadly. Things had somehow changed without her knowledge, but it did not seem like a change for the better. She bit her lip and forced herself to be optimistic. She could be gone from here in a day or two, and then Daniel would be but a twinkle in the grand scheme of things, so she should just be happy, right? She plastered a giant fake smile on her face, even though she didn't feel much better from that thought on the inside. She had hoped that if attraction didn't work out for them, they'd at least have friendship, but it seemed she wasn't to have either with Daniel. He handed her the plate and cutlery, then bent to fix them each a coffee from the steaming pot she had somehow missed. Maggie almost didn't feel like keeping up the charade with him, but was too hungry to decline the meal, irrespective of her pride, so she waited until he was seated with his plate. It was at this point that Daniel looked her in the eye with what she hoped was longing in his eyes. Then he folded his hands, closed his eyes, and lowered his head. Maggie felt the tears prickling at her eyes again as she too lowered her head and gave a prayer for more than just the food. She was so confused by Daniel and his wild emotions. One moment she swore they were on the same page, and the next they were total strangers. Trying to distract herself from the need to cry after exposing her vulnerability to him, she cut and lifted a piece of meat to her mouth and nearly sighed aloud in pleasure, only just managing to stop herself. Daniel heard her sharp intake of breath and asked without looking at her face, "Do you like it?" He knew that he was falling hard for her because each time he looked at her, he found her achingly more beautiful than the last, and it was becoming increasingly difficult to resist wanting to kiss her and forget everything else. She sounded breathless when she responded, causing him to look up at her against his better judgment. "This is the most incredible thing I've ever tasted." She lay her hand over her mouth as if in shock. "You, sir, are a culinary genius." Daniel looked away embarrassed, but had no doubt she could see the blush he could feel on his cheeks. Maggie, henceforth, had no problem continuing the meal in silence and finishing her deliciously sweet and strong coffee while Daniel stoked the fire. He really was a most spectacular cook, she thought as she watched him tend the fire and make their dishes disappear. He came back in the room with a thick plastic bath. "Did you get the paracetamol I left for you?" he asked this as he put the bucket down before her chair. "Paracetamol?" she asked with raised eyebrows and looked at him. "Yes," was his reply as he took a pot filled with steaming water and began pouring the water into the bucket at her feet. "I left it on the bedside table, just in case you were still in pain once you woke up." Her voice was thick, and she seemed to have trouble talking when she replied, I didn't see it, but thank you." Daniel grunted in reply. He couldn't look at her when she was vulnerable. He didn't want her to see that she made him feel vulnerable. And he also desperately fought the need to pull her into his arms and kiss her senseless until she stopped crying and began moaning. He fetched some cold water in a jug, his packet of Epsom salts and a towel, grateful for the small opportunity to escape her overwhelming presence. But he missed her feminine scent something fierce. As soon as he left the room, he was honestly twice as grateful to return as he had been to leave. "What's all this?" she asked shakily, and swallowed deeply as he kneeled before her. "Allow me to bathe your feet, Maggie. Then we'll start exercising it," he said slowly and put his hands on her enclosed feet. "You'll probably be back on your feet in a few days." He wasn't really asking, but he glanced up at her to see whether she would allow it. What he saw as he looked at her made him feel fiercely possessive of her. Her hair had been haphazardly tied up in a lopsided bun so that he could fully see her face in the golden glow. Every graceful angle, from the bridge of her nose to the curve of her chin. He also saw the sad, hesitant look in her eyes and the dancing sparkle of the fire as it lit the moisture pooling in her eyes. As if she didn't trust her voice, she bit her lip, looked away from his knowing eyes, and nodded her head. She also cupped her hands together and held it to her chest, then lay her head on it as if she needed to be cuddled. Daniel almost wasn't able to stop himself from taking her into his arms and giving her what she needed, but he reminded himself to be strong. He wouldn't take her down a path of false promises because she deserved so much more. He instead carefully removed her shoes and gently placed her feet into the warm, salted water. She let a sigh of contentment escape her mouth, and he smiled, fully understanding the feeling. He too sorely missed having warm water to shower in, but putting water on the fire would take a very long time to warm it up. It could take a couple of hours just to make the kettle warm enough for 4 cups of coffee. In truth, the water wasn't unbearably cold. It was just not hot, but he thanked God that he decided to go green last year and had insulated everything, including his pipes and geyser, or they'd only have ice to wash with. Daniel tenderly bathed her feet, then went off to wash his hands and let her feet soak for a short while. When he returned, Maggie sighed and almost cursed herself aloud as she let the question slip from her lips. "Why do you hate me, Daniel?" Daniel turned raised eyebrows her way with a surprised, "Huh?" "I get that I'm in your space, and that makes you a little out of your element. I'm sorry about that, but what I don't get is why you hate me." It seemed that once she started, she just couldn't seem to shut up. The last thing she wanted was an awkwardness to settle between them, but right now she couldn't handle the atmosphere as it was. It had begun to fray her nerves, and she still felt vulnerable, which made her feel more on edge. "I don't hate you, he said and frowned. This was the last thing he wanted her to feel, but how could he explain how he felt about her without telling her exactly how she made him feel? Somehow I don't exactly believe you, she said softly. He turned his back to her and growled softly in frustration. How could he convince her? The thought hit him like a ton of bricks. If he found out why she thought he hated her, he could alleviate her fears without admitting his feelings for her. Why would you think that I hate you? He asked gently, and turned around to face her. Well, when you say my name, you get this weird look on your face as if you are... She struggled to find the words. Angry at me for something. See there, she said, pointing as a full scowl twisted his handsome features. He growled at her, bringing up the memory of his first love, and turned to storm off and rein in his temper, but her shout stopped him. No, damn it, she said loudly and clenched her teeth in frustration. You don't get to do that to me, especially not after today. Daniel turned to look at her and his anger immediately faded. She clutched his couch so hard her knuckles had turned white. He had the distinct feeling that if it weren't for her injured foot, she'd be standing. Her chest was heaving, and that redness that seemed to have taken residence on her cheeks was back. She was as a goddess to him, with a wrath not to be trifled with. But even though she seemed strong, he saw the vulnerability in her eyes and knew exactly what he'd done wrong. Ashamed of himself, Daniel hung his head and apologized, surprised that it was the first time he'd ever used her name, and didn't feel the urge to throw something or a slight pain grip his chest. It's okay, this was said gently, but then she spoke a bit more forcefully. But you need to tell me what's going on. I can't help you if I don't know what's wrong. He looked at her oddly as if he didn't fully believe she wanted to help, but sighed and decided there was no harm in giving in. Okay, I think we should stop there for today, and we'll just do our scripture of the day quickly. Unless otherwise indicated, all the following scripture quotations are taken from the Holy Bible, New Living Translation, with copyright by Tyndale House Foundation, used by permission of Tyndale House Publishers, all rights reserved. Our scripture of the day comes from James 2 verse 23, which says, And so it happened, just as the scriptures say, Abraham believed God, and God counted him as righteous because of his faith. He was even called the friend of God. So let's hope that we can be friends of God today and moving forward. I'd love to have God as a homie. I don't know about you. Sounds like a good deal. Anyway, thank you for joining me. I hope that you've had a great time. I hope that you have a phenomenal day further. All my links are in the description. Don't forget you are welcome to connect with me on Instagram, Twitter, or read my things on Wattpad. And yeah, thanks so much for joining. Have a phenomenal day. Bye.